So Anna, when I first came to my first forum, it was with a panel with Anna, and it was a really great experience. And every year Anna has been part of this, and now coming into the last bit of the day, she's going to facilitate this. Anna is, of course, the Professor of Economics at the University of Waikato's Management School. Her research focuses on trade and international economic policy and how it shapes the global economy. So couldn't think of anyone more qualified to have a discussion right now on social investment. So Anna, thank you for facilitating this, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow, those lights are bright when they come on. And thanks very much for getting back to your seat. It's hard that last morning, isn't it? You wanted to catch up with people, but it's been a wonderful conference. Delighted to join you for this session on social investment. 2 years ago, some of you who are regulars may remember that we had a session on social investment, and at that time we focused on the question of what difference will it make? Well, here we are 2 years later, and we're going to build on that conversation with a focus on whether social investment represents a generational shift or whether it risks reckless profiling. Social investment in New Zealand, I think most of us are familiar with this idea. It's data-driven, it's evidence-driven. It really aims to use the data and the early intervention to improve outcomes. But it also raises hard questions about things like targeting, risk profiling, labelling, and the exercise of state power. So for a small country like New Zealand, this is a very much on-topic panel. We've got limited resources. It's not just a technical debate. It's really choices about the sorts of social policy system we want in the long run. So I'm delighted to be joined by our three panelists. Graeme is well known to many of you. He's been quite a regular at our forums. In fact, last year, I was remembering that he stepped in at the very last moment for Max, who had a flight issue. And Graeme stepped in on the tax panel last year, so we've given him a little more notice this year, but really delighted to have you with us, Graeme. Graeme is a director at Saperi. He's chair of the Social Investment Board and a former secretary of the Treasury, so very well known to many of us in the room. Rachel Inosa is the chief executive of the Cause Collective and the establishment chief executive of the Tātua Collective, which is the Whana Ora commissioning agency for Pacific peoples. So we're delighted to have the perspectives that you're going to bring to this, Rachel. Max Rashbrook is a senior research fellow at the School of Government at Victoria University of Wellington. He's a writer on inequality and democratic renewal, and we're really delighted to have you here, Max, in person, live, and looking forward to the different perspectives that each of our panelists will bring to this really important discussion. Just a reminder, we welcome your questions from the floor. I've got the iPad ready, so please do feed those questions through, and our wonderful team at the back does some light editing sometimes, but then forwards them through. But to start with, what I'd like to do is turn to each of the panelists in turn and ask them just to take a couple of minutes setting up some context to the discussion, to the perspectives that they each bring, and focusing on, you know, what's the biggest benefit of social investment in New Zealand, what's the biggest risk, and which should weigh most heavily for a small country like ours, and why? So Graeme, let's start with you, please.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back at this forum. I've always enjoyed them greatly. I must clarify, though, just for the record, that as chair of the advisory board, I have no governance function over the SIA, and I'm not in any way representing the government here or the SIA. And some of the views I'll give will be personal. Look, this conference is about big choices that our country must face, and the choice I want to talk about is how to improve the effectiveness of the resources that we're spending in social policy. The need for change is obvious and well known. The statistics continue to show that social outcomes for Māori and Pacific lag behind by substantial amounts. the rest of the population, but then within the rest of the population, behind the averages, there are cohorts in there that are similarly disadvantaged to Māori and Pacific. And we've got to think about, well, why is that after so many years of us talking about this problem, and what is it that social investment can do about it? And the proposition that I'll put to you is well known, but worth repeating, that the scope of the resources for social investment that we're spending, firstly, is not just about what the government's spending, because the complementary resources provided by philanthropy, by community organisations, by volunteers, by families and individuals themselves. There's a lot more resources than just the government's resources that are involved in this. And as has been well documented by the Productivity Commission 10 years ago, at a time when I was a commissioner, the way in which the government is funding a lot of social policy, for all its benefits in many dimensions, when it comes to the way in which it funds not only its own services, but contracts out to other providers, inherent in the way they do it are distortions to the objectives, the way they're set, the way they're monitored and achieved, and also is hopeless in tailoring support for families in particular situations and communities. So what are the essential elements of social investment that represent a promising addition to the way in which we do social policy? Well, first of all, it's setting objectives in terms of outcomes, whereas the system at the moment is inclined to set as objectives the delivery of services, rather than what those services actually result in. Secondly, for some of the services, the decisions are being made in the wrong places and should be made much closer in communities to those families, and for some policies, the support should go directly to the families. Thirdly, there's a need for an emphasis on constant reallocation and agility in tuning services up and reframing them on the basis of flows of information, which has not been happening. And finally, and terribly importantly, we need policies and practices for data democracy, data ownership, governance, privacy, and in particular, interoperability, so that data can travel safely across systems. Other point I want to emphasize is that the original vision of Whānau Ora is an exemplar of some of the principles that we think in my board is vital for social investment to take on. In particular, and most importantly, is the overarching kaupapa to support people and families to be resilient in moving towards preferred life courses. The tools of social investment can be applied not only the 190 million that's going to get spent in 4 years through the fund, but also back in the 80 to 90 billion, which is being spent directly from inside the government. I think with careful implementation we can do this, because there are live examples. This isn't new. There are many organisations out there at the moment doing exactly this. They just don't get the visibility that they deserve. And the board's got a lot of case studies that I can perhaps talk about in questions that prove that. Finally, what are the risks about all of this? To me, they're all in the implementation. This is complicated. It involves sensitive political issues. It involves change management away from dealing with problems that have already emerged into preventive, and that means shifts in resources. Now, what I've said so far sounds very sort of nerdy and economistic, which it is. The thing I want to emphasize from the studies that we've already done is that all the successful examples of this show a capacity for collaborative behaviours and cultures in organisations which are absolutely essential to solve the problem of how money that's trickling down vertically gets spread sideways and downwards with different accountabilities. You can only do that with changes in culture and organisations, and those cultures will slowly emerge as the government changes the way it deals with them. So I think the start that's been made in social investment is worthy. We had a hiatus for a while. The SIA is a start-up in many respects. It's going to be years to get all of this in place. But I'm recommending that we should take this initiative seriously, keep working at it over a period of years ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Graeme. Rachel.
Thank you. So my background is more in community development and social entrepreneurship, so that's how I will approach the questions that have been asked. When I think about the theme for the forum, looking at big choices as a small nation, certainly how we choose to use our data is one of those big choices that we now face. Are we going to use our data to create a better future for everybody, for all New Zealanders, or are we going to use it to continue to tell the story of the future that we already know, that we already have? I am a big supporter of the social investment approach, but let me explain a little bit more about my opening statement there. I think the challenge we've had to date with social investment is that we have focused a lot on retrospective administrative data, which tells an important part of the story, but it doesn't tell all of the story for individuals and families who are in need. And when we're making decisions, investment decisions, there's also other data that we should be considering. The part of the question for this posed to this panel is about the benefits and thinking about the prevention system. It's very hard to invest in the prevention system when most of the focus is on the bottom of the cliff, if we put it that way. So a lot of the investment is based on looking at need, that level of need, and that's appropriate. But when we just look at investing in the bottom of the cliff, we only treat the symptoms, and we don't actually get around to looking at the causes of complex social problems. And looking at generational shifts, I think we need to tell ourselves the truth. If we don't look at the causes of complex social issues, then we're never actually going to get the generational shifts that we're after. Because I like social entrepreneurship, one of the other things that comes to mind to me when I think about this topic is some other organisations around the world and looking at what they're doing. And there are sophisticated organisations that have realised the benefit of real-time insights and data and information. And in having those, they're able to anticipate and respond to need very quickly. And the example I use here is some of the big tech companies. So if we think about Google, Meta, and Amazon, some people might argue that those large tech companies know more about the lives of everyday Kiwis than any government agency will. And why is that? Well, it's because they offer a clear value exchange. We give them our data and they give us something of value in return, whether that is social interaction, access to products and services in a very convenient way, or whether it's a transfer of knowledge and information on topics that we're actually interested in. These are all things one might suggest that we want our community and public services to do. And I think that is the real opportunity here, is that we look at what we're doing in the social investment space and how we can start to partner with individuals, families and communities to input their data and insights in real time and to help inform decision making that's being made. If we can understand better their decision making processes, their preferences for services, their behaviours and attitudes towards different areas of social policy or social investment, then we can see some real change happening. To the risk side, sure, there's plenty of risk there in terms of looking at social investment and whether it becomes something that we use to socially profile different cohorts of the population. But I think if we are looking at how we can engage individuals and families directly into the process, that starts to go away, that level of risk starts to dissipate. To me, the biggest risk here is that we continue doing what we're currently doing, that we accept inertia in the system and we just continue as status quo. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Graeme and Rachel, for those really thoughtful contributions. I wanted to offer a critique, not of social investment itself, which I think is a basic concept, is really hard to disagree with, but a caution about a particularly narrow version of what social investment could be, which I think is implicit in some of the things that people say and think about social investment and some of the hopes that people have for it. And the thing I want to critique here is the search for the cascade, the perfect, cheap micro-intervention that, by making some kind of change in people's lives, will then cascade right throughout the rest of their life course and suddenly solve all of their issues. I take that term cascade from an article by the American economist Megan Stevenson, who wrote a really amazing 2023 paper that I recommend people read, and it's called Cause, Effect, and the Structure of the Social World. And in this paper, she's looking at randomized controlled trials, so the gold standard of evidence, about interventions in American criminal justice. And these interventions are everything from the softer end, you might say, rehabilitation programs, behavioral regulation programs, post-incarceration employment programs, right through to the more punitive end, scared straight, boot camps, that kind of thing. And her main conclusion is that when you look at the evidence around these programs, the search for that really amazingly cheap but effective intervention is, quote, mostly a myth, end quote. Stevenson looks at 120 randomized controlled trials about American criminal justice interventions. Fewer than a quarter of them show any real positive impact. And even those ones that have one positive study are almost never replicable. So they're highly contingent on the place they were done, the people who were delivering that service, the background conditions. Now, there is obviously a question about how generalizable Stevenson's findings are. Not everything is necessarily like the American criminal justice system. And I'm certainly not saying that I think there are no targeted interventions in social services in New Zealand that work. But I do think the lessons of that paper should give us real caution about thinking that there are these amazing, cheap, effective interventions just out there waiting to be discovered. And the reason that Stevenson says so many of the interventions are ineffective is because everyone is embedded in a social context that is very, she calls it a stabilizer, but you could also say it's very sticky. And if people are living in communities that are really, really struggling with poverty, with experiencing discrimination and racism, with low educational outcomes, with poor health, with all kinds of problematic background conditions, and you pluck them out of those conditions for a moment, you deliver an intervention to them, and then they go back to those same conditions, why would we expect their lives to be profoundly changed? And I think that intuition is consistent with what we know of history. And when we think about the things that really changed New Zealand life in the 20th century, the big choices for a small nation, to go back to the title for this event, they were big, expensive, universalist or quasi-universalist government programs. So free public education, free public health care, at least for secondary care, the creation of a social security net, even things like state housing, not universal, but a big, big systematic intervention. None of this is an argument, as I said, against social investment per se. What I want to caution people against is allowing the idea of social investment, perhaps distorted, Graeme might argue, to narrow our focus and to close ourselves off from recognizing that there are very, very big picture forces that we need to grapple with, and those things have to be in our minds all the time when we're thinking about tackling social issues, when we're thinking about social investment.
Thank you very much for those intro comments that give an idea of the rich perspectives that we've got in this area. Max, your comments actually lead me into one of the first questions that we've got, and it's really, I guess, grappling with this idea of what problem is social investment trying to solve that traditional approaches didn't, and do we actually have what's the evidence, what does it actually tell us about whether social investment impacts outcomes? Is it strong? Is it still uncertain? What sort of evidence do we have on this? If we start with you, Max, and then we'll check in with Rachel and Graeme.
Well, I think in a sense it's probably too early to say. I mean, I think Graeme's point about Social Investment Agency being a startup was well made. I mean, it really is early days, and I don't think we should expect miracles from it yet. I mean, and despite my opening comments, obviously I do think there's promise in the approach itself about mobilising better data, about being more rigorous at evaluating what government does, about trying to put money into the things that will have a long-term impact. I think one of the problems is that, and Rachel would know this probably better than anyone else, when you're engaging with families, with whānau, with individuals who are really, really struggling, the reality is that effective interventions are liable to take quite a long time to show their impacts. And another great danger, I think, in this area, one is a narrowing of focus, another one is sort of tyranny of the data, doing things because there's data on them rather than because they're necessarily the most effective intervention. And I think the third one is because social investment exists in a political context, the great danger is that immediate results are seized on and are taken as evidence of effectiveness, when actually over 10 years, the things that look ineffective initially might be the things that are most effective, and the things that look really good in the short term actually don't have lasting effects. So, what is social investment doing? I think it's too early to say, yeah.
So cautious optimism. Rachel, from your perspective, what evidence have you seen? Is it strong? Where is it uncertain? Where does social investment really make a difference from your perspective, very close to the ground?
Yeah. So the first point I wanted to make was about outcomes, because there is a lot of talk and rhetoric about outcomes. And I think in practical terms, there's quite a bit of work still to be done to take frontline service providers into that space of being able to deliver to outcomes, because really the contracts and the systems are still very much purchasing outputs. And so getting to the evidence base where we can really say, well, there's measurable impacts and outcomes in the medium to longer term, we don't have that yet. If I think about the work we're doing in whānau water commissioning, the benefit of having decisions made closer to communities, we are already starting to see that. So, we're certainly new to the space. We're still in the first 12 months of establishment. But if I think about some of the data that we're already seeing, one of the big priority areas, I think about 40% of the families that we're working with, they say that financial stress is their top priority. And, it would be easy to think, okay, the solution is going to be, financial stress, it's budgeting advice, or let's put something in there to support them on a pathway towards greater financial literacy. But then when we unpack that and look at more of that demand side data that I was talking about earlier, we get to see that actually a lot of these families have the literacy and the understanding. There are other issues that are sitting there that are keeping them financially stressed, and that might be related to the fact that they provide remittance to their families in Pacific homelands, or it might be that there's been funerals in the family or cultural obligations that they have to give money to. So things like that, which actually tell a different story. It's not necessarily just a blanket approach to budgeting advice. There's something else that's actually needed that we can target our services to support these families into more financial stability.
Thank you very much. We've got quite a specific question here, and I wonder, Graeme, whether this is something that you might like to have a go at. Should the government and philanthropists make significant use of social impact bonds? Is that something you've given any thought to, Graeme?
Yes, quite a lot, but I'd like to answer the
You'd like to
previous
comment on that
question
one
to
first? Sure.
contextualise it, because I think, can you hear me? I was given this, is it all right?
It's all good.
One? Yeah, closer. I think the context that Max and Rachel have put forward there is perfect for me to say what I wanted to say. Firstly, that social investment is not a Swiss army knife that can be used for all sorts of different things. It takes place inside a context of those large policies that Max has described. But then listen to what Rachel said. You're in a situation where what looked like somebody had a financial problem for which the answer was a budgetary problem, and it turned out there was something else behind the budgetary problem. And that's the very kind of circumstance where these methods can add most. And the reason they can is that instead of an organisation like Rachel's and many others having some of their money coming at them to do budgetary support, some of it coming up to help people get a job, some of it coming up to help people with family violence and drug problems, what it does is pull that money and put it in the hands of organisations like Rachel's, where they make the decision as to what do you do in response to what you see. And that's where the enormous efficiency gain comes, particularly for people with long-lasting, complex problems, which the Productivity Commission report called Quadrant D, for those who are familiar with it. So I've been very careful to say that social investment is there for dealing with certain kinds of problems and should stay away from others. Now, what are the certain kinds of problems, and I will come to the bond in a moment, that it's solving? Think about it this way. Social investment, for the nerds amongst you, can be seen as a generic solution to a problem of collaboration where all your lines of accountability are vertical, but the situations you're trying to apply to require accountability lines that are horizontal between people working together in a collective of some kind, and downwards to people whose lives you're trying to support to put on a better track. Inland Revenue uses exactly the same kind of techniques and models with the tax system. So partly this is a generic solution to the collaboration problem which the Productivity Commission put its finger on. Where do social bonds belong in this? Well, can I leave the ideological preferences people may or might have about that and look at it from a technical standpoint? What you're trying to do is to leverage the government's resources, not only with other financial resources that charities and so on bring to the table, but the volunteer work, the energy that's in other organisations, which I also mentioned. And so there will be circumstances where a social bond of some kind is an efficient way of leveraging the government's involvement, shifting some risks that the government is not good at managing into the private sector. There are bonds where, there's lots of these things around the world. New Zealand's very slow to get onto it. But they do have a place in the scheme of things, but it's relatively small in the larger scheme of things. Thank you.
Thanks. We've got a very popular question here that follows on really nicely from what we've just been discussing there. And the question is, and I'm going to start with you, Rachel, on this one because it follows on really well from some of the comments you were making. Do we actually have the institutional capacity to implement it well? Or is implementation the biggest risk?
When you say institutional capacity, are you talking about from a government perspective? Or?
Well, let's start with your perspective. So what's your perspective on the capacity we have to implement it well? And then we'll take it up to our other panellists and talk at a perhaps government institutional level as well.
Well, I can respond to that probably from the community commissioning position. And I think it's a huge undertaking to do community-based commissioning, which is essentially devolution of parts of what government does into a community setting. I absolutely think it is the right thing to do, and we should be talking more about devolving services. but it is a huge undertaking. I think about the whirlwind of activity that we have had to do to stand up a new commissioning agency in less than 12 months and have a frontline workforce hit the ground running, picking up caseloads effectively immediately. That we've done it, but it has required a lot of learning as we go, learning by doing, and also working very closely with our government partners. And it's new ways of working, and rough and ready is okay, but I think if we keep doing what we've already always been doing, we will never actually get to that point of change if we say, oh, well, have we got capacity? We have to find a way to make it work.
Thanks. And, Max and Graeme, I'll also ask you about this sort of institutional capacity to implement it well, but if you could also give your thoughts on, is it politically durable in New Zealand, as well as the institutional capacity? So, Max, perhaps we can turn to you.
Yeah, look, I would echo a lot of what Rachel said. I've recently helped launch a think tank called the Institute for Democratic and Economic Analysis. One of our first reports was on welfare to work services, which included looking at youth employment schemes in particular. And there's a huge amount of overlap and duplication there. You've got programs like He Potama Rangatahi, the Mayor's Task Force for Jobs, the Youth Service, all doing relatively similar things with different pots of money. And one of the things that we called for in our report on that issue was exactly community commissioning. But to stand that up, to empower those organisations to come together and jointly decide what it is that they need in each given area, and then compete for a joined up pool of money from government, is a pretty significant undertaking. And so one of the questions I would have is, how are those organisations going to be resourced to do that community commissioning? Another institutional capacity thing, I think, is about the quality and the availability of data. In these conversations, people often are very full of excitement about the integrated data infrastructure, the IDI, as it's often known, which is this huge database of joined up administrative data on your interactions with government. And look, it is a very impressive resource, but when I go and talk to NGOs who work in the social sector, they say there's so much data that matters about people's lives that is not in the IDI, and it's not anywhere near the IDI, because some of these people aren't even interacting with government, or are doing so as little as possible. There's so much qualitative data about the quality of people's lives, their social relations, their community, that at the moment is just not captured at all. So there's a question about how well can we do social investment if we don't have all those data sources. And just lastly, is it politically durable? Well, Chris Hipkins was asked about this recently on Morning Report, I think. In my recollections, he said that Labour would maintain social investment, at least in some form. I think Labour's decision to effectively mothball it while in government last time was a really significant mistake, and frustrating, because I think the wellbeing approach, the living standards framework that Labour implemented, and social investment are not nearly as different as their respective partisans would have you believe. I think everyone is moving slowly towards recognising that we need to see people more holistically and have a better idea of what works holistically. There is still some residual resistance or resentment, I think, towards social investment on the left because of some of the mistakes that were made when Mark I was implemented by people like Paula Bennett, and some of the ways that I think people were stigmatised through that process. But I think that is easing. I think we're getting towards a better, not exactly a consensus, but hopefully a more sensible approach towards social investment.
Just on the institutional question, some of it's easy. There's no particular difficulty, although it just requires work and focus, but all the equipment's in place to get the major ministries to tune up their capacity for doing data and analytics and helping to use that information to do this kind of thing. within their existing businesses. It doesn't all have to be about huge collaborations or even community commissioning. There's a lot that can be done with the structures you've already got by shifting the focus from delivering services to thinking about what you're producing with the services. And there's a wonderful case study I don't have time to talk about which illustrates precisely the point. The institutional challenge is much more in the area that Rachel was talking about, which is when you do community commissioning, who are you doing it with? Do these organisations exist? In a lot of cases they don't, but what we do know, the ones that do work, there's enough of them that succeed in doing that, and a lot of lessons from whānau are relevant here. So it is clear we can do it. And can I move to the data question though, because Max is making a point which is enormously important to me. There's a cartoon version of social investment which says, first of all, you set an outcome target, like we want everybody to be in work or something or other, pass some exam. Then you allocate some money to somebody who's allowed to do just about anything they want to with this money to reach this conclusion, but it's going to be very rich in data. You'll know exactly whether they did it or not. Well, that's a cartoon. There are so many places where you can't meet those conditions, and yet you can see on the ground organisations already doing things which are much better than the status quo. This stuff doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be better than what you're getting now. In a lot of cases, what you're getting now is plainly distorted by problems of collaboration and vertical lines of accountability going to organisations who've built their whole business processes around those structures. You know, what the government's got out there is what it deserves from the way it's been funding. So the big challenge, I think, is to get community commissioning to work, but there's clear evidence that it can. It's just going to take a lot of care and attention to get it in place.
And I'm going to come to Rachel in just a moment on this community commissioning. But just a comment on the data. I mean, you know, data is hugely important. We're in this context of making big choices for a small country. In order to make those choices, you need to have some transparency about what the data is, what the objectives are, what you're achieving, what you're not achieving. But the problem with this area, or one of the problems, is that a lot of it is much more complex than some of our data can capture. There's a lot of interactive things. There's a lot of qualitative outcomes that are really important, but are very difficult to measure in a meaningful way. And, you know, this is from an economist that thinks about data a lot, but I also recognise the limitations in these sorts of situations. But Rachel, if we can talk a little bit more about this community commissioning. You know, how does it change who holds the power, and how trust is built?
Yeah. So I think ultimately we want to see that shift in power, and when we talk about power, I'm thinking also the decision making, as has been mentioned, bringing that closer to families and communities who are directly impacted by the services that they're receiving. Just touching on the data, so one of the things that we are seeing in the community commissioning emerge is that sometimes the data, the administrative data that we capture versus the data that we get from the insights we gather from individuals and families, there can be differences in the data sets. And sometimes people might think that is a problem or a challenge, or what do you do when community's saying one thing, but actually the data that we're putting into the IDI is saying something different. I don't think it is a problem. I think what, as Max had mentioned, sometimes we only capture a small part of people's lives in the data. It's when they enter the system, then we gather that information on them. But there's such a richness of information that we're also capturing. If I think about what we're doing in whānau ora is very strengths-based. So we capture information about the strengths of families. So looking at their social and cultural capital that exists there, which is often hidden or invisible when we're just looking at need and risk. And we also capture information about their aspirations. Now, that's key when you're thinking about behaviour change. what is driving those families for the change, what are their hopes and dreams for the future. So being able to get the full picture of what's happening for families, then we start to be able to see decision-making and power shift in the way that we're making those decisions. Just the final point I would make about the differences in the data, I think the administrative data is very good at telling us what the problem is, and the whānau and individual level data is very good at telling us why that problem is persistent and very tricky to solve.
So let me follow on from that, and Max, I'll turn to you first and then seek some comments from Graeme on this one. How do we ensure that social investment strengthens rather than undermines trust? And what safeguards accountability are essential if the state is using predictive data to target interventions? Any comments from you, Max?
Yeah, I think, I'll be really interested in Graeme's take on this. I think, I don't have a detailed technical answer, but I think there's a generic point that you can make that's really important, and I think in a way Rachel's made it already. It is about a degree of individual and community control over these processes. And so that's not just the devolution of some choices about what kind of services do people receive, which obviously is at the heart of whānau ora, and I think that's incredibly powerful. But it's also making sure that people feel ownership over their data and they know how their data is going to be used, that social investment really delivers on its promise, the same promise that is made through whānau ora, that this is not about doing things to people, it is about doing things with them. I think that's absolutely crucial because, and again, I think there were some mistakes made, particularly in social investment Mark 1, where the approach did seem to be, let's draw up a map of all the problems that people have and how they concentrate, and let's really hone in on the 5% of families who we think are a problem. And that was the whole dynamic, and that is not something that's going to increase trust or people's sort of sense of positivity about the thing. But if you are saying, look, okay, this is actually genuinely about empowering people, and we're going to be transparent about all of this, and you are going to be empowered through this process, and we put structures in place that make sure that that happens, then I think that's conducive to a system that people trust.
The data governance and ownership issues are absolutely crucial to this, otherwise you'll destroy trust. And Max is right, they made some very bad decisions earlier about the coercive use of data, which sort of got as far as saying, if you don't give us your data, we won't give you the money. And so what you need is a prior set of principles about data ownership, the control of data, and the permissioning of data to be used for legitimate purposes, and that includes the state. Unless it's got legislative power under the Stats Act or something to use data for some purpose, it's got no more right to use it than anyone else without permission. And that needs to be made clear. The other point I really want to emphasise, that's been made, but I want to underscore it. You see, to get trust inside these community organisations as they emerge, it's got to be very clear that they set their goals for their organisation to give the kind of support of exactly the sort that we've seen in 18 evaluations of the South Island whānau ora, for example. But if you want government money, they're going to say, we want you to achieve these things. And so they're an addition. You know, the government might want to have something like, I want to see all the kids in school or whatever it is. But that's just one thing within a collective which is connected to a target population that it naturally serves. And it may have completely separate overall objectives about raising the mana and the waiora of these families, with ideas about them moving their lives onto better courses, and that's what they're there for. One of the things they're doing, if they want government money, is, well, tick off some objectives which you have to get the money. So this is not about deconcentrating the state. It is about a passage of power out of the centre to these organisations, and that's why it's complicated to get right. If you make a mistake, you don't get the trust you need to get the collaborative behaviours that you want.
Thanks. Max, I'm going to ask you or address a question to you on social investment. Is it worth the privacy that must be sacrificed? And then I'd like to follow up with you, Rachel, and talk about from the perspective of families and communities, what makes early intervention feel supportive rather than intrusive. So, Max, would you like to make some comments on privacy, giving up privacy to achieve these objectives? What's the trade-off?
I think in a way Rachel might be better placed to address that than me. I mean, I would just say, when you're dealing with things like the integrated data infrastructure, privacy is built into it. People aren't identifiable through it. So I would hope that there are ways to manage that. I wonder if I might sort of pick up on a point that Graeme was making, which interests me about social investment. I totally agree that a lot can be done just by improving the way that contracting happens. I talk to NGOs who say, look, the Social Investment Agency could just take the 35 contracts we have with government and sort of pare them down to 2 or 3. That alone would actually be quite transformative, and I'm all for that. But if we're going to do more joined up contracting, if we're going to sort of get out all these siloed pots of money, and people are going to be able to access these streams of funding that come from lots of different government departments, how is that actually going to happen? Does the Social Investment Agency become this new super procurer that is in charge of handing out any pot of money that is basically a wicked problem that is multifactorial, that crosses lots of different government agency boundaries? If so, how then does the Social Investment Agency interact with the rest of government? On one level, this is a very sort of policy wonk question, but an awful lot of initiatives within government have come crashing to a halt because of boundary disputes between different government agencies. So for me, that's a big question that's in the air. But I think on the privacy stuff, Rachel, you might have a better take on that.
But I'm actually, because I'm looking at the clock as well, so I'm actually going to give Rachel the opportunity to do a wrap-up comment, and she can wrap in the privacy into that as well. But I guess the wrap-up comment that I'd like from each of our panellists is, given this topic, the small country, big choices, the next 5 to 10 years, what's the single most important choice that New Zealand needs to make about social investment? So Rachel, you're welcome to talk about privacy and support at first, but then, what's your take on the most important choice that New Zealand needs to make in this area of social investment to see us through the next 5, 10 years, and then we'll give Max and Graeme the chance to wrap up on that as well.
Okay, thank you. Look, I will just be brief on the privacy issue, because I think, to me, it's already the answer. It goes back to trust and high trust relationships. When people trust us with their information, they're more likely to engage. When they engage with us, we get better insight. We can use that insight to invest better and then get better outcomes. And to me, the system we're operating in, the system has got to be trust. So that would be my response to thinking about privacy. In terms of thinking about the one thing.
One thing.
Look, I think social investment has so much opportunity if we can do it right, if we can do it alongside families and communities and not to them. And I think we have to learn from the mistakes of the past and not repeat them. And I also think we need courage and leadership and people in positions who do hold the power at the moment to be brave and courageous and to do that on behalf of those families and communities who are often invisible in the data or in the system. And I think that is what's needed for this next season as we make some big choices in our country.
Max, the most important thing from your perspective, single thing?
I think I'll just offer a twist on the point that I made at the outset. I think a really important thing for social investment is to be clear about the direction of causality of social problems. We had a great session earlier on NCEA and reform, and a point that was sort of hovering in the air and was partially made, but could have been made more fully, is that very little of what affects children's results at school happens within the school gates. When you look at the meta-reviews and the evidence, variation in school marks, about 20% of it is explained by what happens within schools. Most of the rest is socioeconomic status, and a lot of that is poverty and people not having the income and the security and the housing and the wealth that they need. And so sometimes in the social investment debate, you get people saying, well, look, we've identified these risk factors, you know, and they're about contact with oranga tamariki, and they're about contact with the justice system and spells on benefits. And these are the causal factors we need to address. I think very often lying behind that is a deeper causal factor, and that is poverty. And we always have to keep that front and centre.
Max, sorry, Graeme, a final comment from...
Just quickly, the one thing which has come through very clearly here, we know how to do most of this, but getting community commissioning right requires clever politics, really clever thinking about what's the nature of these relationships that can be described as high trust. What does that actually mean? It doesn't mean just give us the money and let us do it. What it means is a mutual trust, different channels of trust, different ways in which trust expressed itself. We've got to figure out how to do that, but there are working models out there. But you've got to get this data thing right. Otherwise, you run enormous risks to trust. Just a small technical point, because the SIA has been so concerned to incubate the fund, it has given some people a concern that this is an Uber, I think as Max described it, some Uber procurement. In other words, the solution to a whole lot of government departments with vertical lines of accountability is to create another one that's also vertical lines of accountability over the top of what you've already got. And it will fail if that's what it is. The success of this lies out there in these communities with a much better relationship with the state and a much deeper response to the people you're trying to help. And this will require the SIA to shift its function to being a central agency and making that work, which you're only really just getting into.
So it's been a very rich discussion and I think there's quite a lot of synchronisation between where we've ended up, but some very different perspectives that each of our panellists bring, that I thank them for that very much. Small country, finite resources. It depends not only what works in something like social investment, but we've also got to do what people believe is fair and empowering. And, you know, to quote Rachel, let's be brave and let's be courageous. So thank you very much to our panellists for the very rich discussion. And I'm sorry we ran out of time for all of those questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. And I think a lot of agreement there that social investment has promise, but it's not a Swiss Army knife. It can't solve every problem. And the better, Max, we get at defining the problem, specificity, the more likely we are to succeed. I'd like to invite, he's already here, Stephen Joyce onto the stage, into a chair for the final panel of the day before we finish up. We've saved the best till last. Trade and security, or trade versus security. Does trade trump security, America or China, and can we have both? And I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. So, Stephen, over to you. Everybody take a seat. This is the last panel, guys, and then we'll be closing up and letting you all head off. Thank you.
Thank you. I wouldn't trust the University of Waikato. No.
Well, kia ora everyone. Good afternoon. We're now into the final session of the forum, and what a fantastic forum it's been. And this is the sunny, upbeat session on the state of the world. And it's a very optimistic time in the world, I think, is what our panel's going to come up with. Perhaps not, we'll see. I want to introduce our panel to you. At the far end, a gentleman called Major General John Howard, who perhaps doesn't have as big a profile as the other two speakers at the forum, but John has had 40 years in the New Zealand Army. He's been deeply involved in intelligence, not just here, but with Five Eyes and in the US. So he is representing the security side of this discussion, I think, very ably. The highlight I picked out of his resume is he was New Zealand's first Chief of Defence Intelligence. and then subsequently, I think, spend time in the US with Five Eyes as well, which we'll come to. But thank you, John, for being here. Next to him, Rosemary Banks, who's been a wonderful career public servant at MFAT, including not one but 2 stints as our ambassador to the United States. It's great to have Rosemary here. And she probably represents foreign affairs in this group. And then over to my immediate left is a gentleman whose life has been trade, I think, and needs no introduction. He was Minister of Trade in the Key government, where I think he spent almost his entire time on a plane. But he's also been an ambassador to the US for New Zealand since that time. So we have 2 US ambassadors and somebody who's been deeply involved in the US, so I dare say the US will come up at some point of the discussion. Folks, thank you very much for being here. The title is Trade versus Security, and does trade trump security? Before we get to that specific question, could I start with a quick thumbnail sketch from each of you on the state of you see the international environment? Because for most people in this room, it looks pretty messy. So can I start with you, John, perhaps? A little bit of context, how are we looking at the moment?
Certainly. Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And a little bit of background to add context. So I am not a serving officer. I do not represent the New Zealand Defence Force or the Minister of Defence. And I'm going to be as frank as I am well known for inside the organisation. My first 25 years of service was operational from Bosnia through to Afghanistan. Today I want to talk about my time as Chief of Defence Intelligence into the Five Eyes community. So I'm not comfortable in the public domain with that, and everything I'll say will be unclassified. And I know we've got, thankfully, media in the audience, and we live in a democracy, which I'm proud of. I did spend 3 years as a Deputy Director at the US Defence Intelligence Agency. That's not New Zealand DIA. 17,000 analysts, a large machine. You'll only find one picture of me doing something there. So we talked about social media. This is my first outing, as it were. So my view of the world, my assessment as we see it today, we should not be surprised, nor should we be shocked. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine in early 22 was not a shock. It was indicated as actions 10 years earlier and as posturing and political manoeuvring well before. In my world, if you're shocked, then someone has not done their job in your planning process. What I would say from a foundational baseline, the era of multilateralism as we know it, effective or not for the foreseeable future, is not something that we as a small nation can rely on. There's a deduction there. Secondly, the US is no longer the trusted, predictable actor that it has been for the last 80 years. And I don't think it will be for some time, if at all in our lifetime. So how then might our largest trading partner and others who seek trade advantage, diplomatic and information advantage view us as a small nation? What will it mean for our national health, wealth and security? And I'm conscious to talk about defence and security. Sometimes we just say defence. It's defence in my mind and security, and it's not a percentage discussion, and I'd really like to talk about that later. And thirdly, as a small island nation, we find ourselves to be strategically adrift in a rising tide of increasing volatility, complexity, uncertainty and ambiguity, with no strategy other than hope, with only the lightest touch of leadership on the strategic tiller, lacking the leadership and vision to drive us forward, not just today and tomorrow, but through what we know and clearly can see on the strategic horizon beyond the election in November. I'm going to pause there.
Well, I think that's a very good start. There's a bit to go on there. Rosemary, you have the perspective of the time that you've had in the service. How does this time compare to any other period that you've been involved?
Well, in the assessment that John's just given, he probably hasn't left me much to say about the state of the world, but I think I'd have to say that I haven't seen a time which has been so hostile, really, to New Zealand's interests, or so volatile or so unpredictable. I think we thought, all of us, when we think back to the first Trump administration, that things had changed, but it really has changed now in a much more significant way. Some of you are probably familiar with Ian Bremer, who runs the Eurasia Group, a really insightful analyst of the US system. He runs every year a big forecast of global risks, and in the 2026 outlook, he identified the US as a major source of global risk in this coming year. And, you know, for us, obviously the US relationship, for many reasons, still remains, as it always has been throughout my career, very important, not always easy to manage, and we've been through our ups and downs. But certainly our old friend is behaving very differently in ways that I think we're still coming to terms with. And a big risk that I see for us, which is kind of new in my career, is that we've got a choice between sort of disappearing and becoming irrelevant, or how we manage this newly changed global environment.
Thanks, Rosemary. Tim, putting a trade lens on it, we've done incredibly well over the years with the multilateral system. You know, small country trading with the world, everybody follows the rules more or less. This is not what we're looking at now, is it?
I'm going to start with Mark Carney's
Sure.
headline from that brilliant speech, which I, along with many other analysts, I think it's a very conventional view, consider is the most important political speech in many a year on the geopolitical economy, when he said, this is not a transition, we're facing a rupture. But a rupture, as I've argued on one or two recent occasions in the media, like a rupture of a dam, doesn't mean the dam has collapsed.
Right.
It doesn't mean, excuse me, that the water is now flooding through, causing mass destruction. So we need to take this very seriously. But the key point I want to give the audience here is that when I say only the United States, it's almost a ludicrous thing to say only when it's 25% of global GDP and has been, as both John and Rosemary have pointed out, the essential enforcer of the rules-based system. But they are the only country amongst the major developed countries that is moving in this direction. All the other major economies, Japan, the whole of the European Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, they all support the rules-based system. And I think that's a very important qualification to a completely pessimistic view of this. The second thing I'd say is that if there is any country in the developed world that actually understands deeply the implications of not having a rules-based system with respect to trade, I'm not talking about the security dimension, which I regard as ultimately the more important issue, it is New Zealand. And the reason for that, I mean, most of the people in the audience are not of a generation that remembers this, because our exports of goods are overwhelmingly agriculture.
Yes.
And until the end of the Uruguay round, there were no operationally effective rules on agricultural trade. And what happened? They bloody killed us every time the cattle cycle or the dairy politics went south. They cut off another piece of our limb. So we have lived in a system which, because of a fatal decision made by the American system in 1947, not to apply the core disciplines of the then GATT to agriculture trade, we had to live in a period of 30 years after the accession of the UK to the then EEC, now the EU, without operationally effective rules. Now, as a result of this, I mean, I don't know whether I want to expand at this point, but my view is that New Zealand has put in place and I say this with enormous respect for what successive Labour governments have done too. I see David in the audience over there. Both Labour and national-led governments, and I've been a negotiator for them both as an official, have put in place a series of what I call an insurance policy, comprehensive network of things that reinforce our rights under the multilateral trading system. And now it's time to cash that insurance policy in.
Right.
So it's not a completely pessimistic view at all.
Right. Okay. Let's, before we go on then, just talk about America for a minute, because it's been a massive change in approach. And there's those of us that scratch our heads and say, well, America created this system for a reason, and it was a good reason post-World War II. And now we look at the state of the US and it's sort of tearing it up, right? I suppose with the three of you having spent so much time in the US, you'd have a view as to what's driving that. I mean, on the surface it's Donald Trump, but of course he gets elected and everything like that. So what is it in the American psyche which is creating the situation that we're in today? Perhaps, Rosemary, if we start with you, explain to us how this has all happened.
Now, I wish I could totally explain it, but let me have a crack at it and we'll all have a go. I think one of the things that's changed in the American outlook is their sense of confidence about their role in the world. That seems to have changed. I first went to the United States to work at the UN in New York in 1983. So this was a period when Ronald Reagan was there, and he was sort of, it was the city on the hill. It was a period of confidence. It was a period when the United States was still dominant in every respect. In more recent times, you can see a sense of anxiety in the population, anxiety about the future, about what their role should be globally, about how they're going to deal with AI. We've talked about a number of the issues that are on American minds. They're on our minds too. But this all sort of plays into this kind of recalibration of the global role that the Trump administration is now doing. And I think there's a really big question of where that goes in future. There's a wonderful saying in French about happiness is what you recognize as it goes out the door. And I think looking back, we can kind of feel a little twang of nostalgia, of regret for the world that we've left, it seems. And I think, as Tim said, Prime Minister Carney's speech made a very clear sort of point about that. But what I've said doesn't entirely explain the sort of retreat from the multilateral system, because admittedly the US, over all of the decades that I've been involved, and I was permanent representative at the UN in New York as well in the past, the US, like the other members of the Security Council, have always used the United Nations system selectively, and I'll leave Tim to comment on the trade system. But I don't think we've really seen them withdraw to this extent. The first Trump administration was also very multilateral skeptic. They resent the fact that their kind of global power is constrained. They sort of see it like, the little guys trying to tie down Gulliver. But I think we're a little too close to this to work out some of the root causes.
The US has always had an isolationist streak, though, hasn't it? I mean,
yes.
There's always been that. And I wonder, John, whether that sort of explains it, whether we're seeing a sort of, a reassertion of this thing, which is, it's about America first. It's not about, late for the First World War, late for the Second World War, all that sort of stuff. Do you see that in the US?
In some respects, and one should never be surprised when a nation does what is in its own interest first.
Yeah.
It's just we may not be used to the Americans doing it directly and overtly in that manner. Our great-grandparents in the First World War would often say the Americans came late, and our grandparents would say the same thing in World War II. They had clear beliefs of where their national interest was and what they were trying to do internally. Since the end of World War II, we've had an 80-year holiday from human history, in my mind. We've been able to step back from what was before, where war and conflict after the Westphalia Treaty was a very different process. Now we've got an administration that is very clear and has been elected on a mandate of some very deliberate outcomes. So it doesn't surprise me that the administration is seeking to change the way things occur. The process is not what we might like, but that's not our process. And the shock, as people talk about it, next week will be the Munich Security Conference. The Vice President last year spoke very clearly about their intentions to drive change, and the change resulted in NATO now spending 2% of GDP on defence. 5%. And then late last year, the Secretary General said 10% is what we need. So the energy that is now moving across what was that system is very different, but it's still in the US interest.
And turning to trade, Tim, I mean, the history of trade the much longer history is mercantilism, isn't it, than the rules-based system. So here we are. Are we heading properly back to mercantilism? I was talking to Jared Kerr on the stage yesterday, and he was a bit more sort of, he was a little bit more relaxed about everything. But, I mean, there's been lots of talk about high levels of tariffs, but they haven't really come through. What's your thoughts? Is the rules-based system able to be resurrected?
Well, I mean, I think this goes back to my core point about us having, through this really extensive network of other agreements with the EU, the UK, the UAE, China, the whole of ASEAN, we have got rules in place to govern us that sit above the multilateral trading system. The second point I'd say, which again is consistent with Jared's more, not panicking sort of approach, is that it's estimated that still 70% of global trade is still dependent on what negotiators around the world use the French word acquis, meaning in literally acquired, meaning the commitments that were put together by 8 successful GATT rounds and incorporated within the WTO, that still supports 70% of world trade. So it's a serious problem, but it's not collapse. People that talk around, the collapse of the whole system are way ahead of the play. Now, with respect to the origins of this, I'm not going to give you a history lesson here, but there is a very famous cliche that was used by negotiators in the Uruguay round called the bicycle theory of international trade. The bicycle theory of international trade, which says international trade policy is like a bicycle stopping at the lights. You can hold it in place for a certain amount of time, but sooner or later, it's got to either move forward or it will slip backwards. And I say this obviously with the benefit of hindsight. I didn't see it at the time. It is now clear that the WTO has been a classic example of the excellent being the enemy of the good. Vast overreach. It has been essentially a failure. It has done nothing in 30 years to add in any significant way to the acquis, the acquired commitments of the system. Rested entirely on the laurels of agreements that were negotiated at least 30 years ago. Now, this is very important to understanding why the Obama administration, well before we'd heard of Trump as anything other than a game show host, started to move away from that system by, I won't describe the process, it's very technical around the appellate body, which is this, and again, a big mistake to try and pretend you could have the Supreme Court of the international trading system overriding, say, the US Senate, a big political error of overreach. But so this started before Trump's come into play, and has now just got progressively worse and worse and worse. So that's where we are, and we need to now take steps along with our friends, allies, and partners to reinforce the acquis that remains in place that is still a huge degree of support for our trading structures.
Before we get a bit further onto what we should do, I just want to get a sense from many of you, but I'll start with John. A lot of people talk about parallels in history, which I know is dangerous and fraught because some things are similar and some things clearly aren't. But is there a parallel in history to the times we're in today, do we think? If you look back, because I presume you've studied world security and so on over a long time, is there a parallel?
For me, I go straight to the colonels' revolt pre-World War II in the late 1930s, where 4 colonels spoke to the government of the day in a public manner that was unacceptable, declaring a lack of preparation, a lack of readiness for an obvious threat that was coming. They were, of course, removed. One was subsequently rehired, and then we had 5 years of World War. I'm not suggesting we're going to have 5 years of World War, but the strategic naivety of what's coming and what those threat, risks, and opportunity are, in my mind, is replicated now.
Around the world?
Globally. Okay, and for New Zealand, the view that we had at that stage of the world, where we traded primarily in one direction, and we hadn't thought about the what if, what next, and how might we move, and the technologies that we were not grasping, I think there are clear, in my mind, waypoints that indicate.
What about you, Rosemary? Do you think there's a historic parallel here?
I'm going to answer your question with a different point. I just want to go back to, Tim said a little moment ago he didn't want to give a history lesson, but I want to just bring a little bit of interesting history on the trade side, because, what we saw last year with the tariffs that were imposed on so-called Liberation Day, and then, of course, increased on us to 15% at the end of July. We saw that run roughshod over even those countries who had free trade agreements. And of course, in our trade history, we've had several attempts to get a free trade agreement with the United States. And one of the things that's totally forgotten, although I'm sure Tim remembers it, is that the very first time we actually asked the US to think about a special trade arrangement with New Zealand was in 1877. Premier Fox wrote to the US consul, who at that time was based in Dunedin, and suggested that it would be to the benefit of both of our countries if we would have a special arrangement that would facilitate the export of wool. And he magnanimously even suggested that perhaps this could be done with Australia. We came back to the charge in the late 1930s and had another run at it, to the extent that the Prime Minister of the day even got an audience with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the White House. But then the Second World War intervened. But fortunately, we had Tim come along much later and drive a huge diversification of our trade agreements. So we've managed to survive without an FTA with the US all of these now centuries. Anyway, that's my little digression into history.
That's really good, though.
I would just add on to the history. Somebody may not know this. When I was, well, the title is ludicrous, Foreign Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister. I was really a note taker, but technically I was Foreign Policy Advisor to Muldoon at a very young age. And as if Muldoon would ever accept advice from anyone, certainly not a 30-year-old. And then I carried on that job with David Longy when he became the Prime Minister. And I remember with David, at the very beginning when things were starting to get ugly on the ANZUS front, I persuaded David very easily to allow me to write a strategy paper proposing an FTA with the United States, because the Americans had just initiated the first ever FTA that they had ever entered into. It was with Israel. And I saw an ouverture, an opening for us. It crashed because of the ANZUS thing. But, we've been trying for, as Rosemary points out, well over a century, and I think we're going to get one soon.
Well, it sounds like the Americans have always been suspicious then a bit of FTAs, if that's our history. I mean, they've done some, but actually they've always then been.
The reason why they changed their policy in 1982 was actually the opposite. It was they were so determined to preserve the principle of MFN that they were opposed to all FTAs. But it was actually from a trade liberalisation respect for international law, so they've moved a long way.
Yes. So let's come to our approach now. And John, you hinted before that you don't think we've taken a strategic view as a country. So let's explore that a little bit. What do you think in this world that we're in? What do we need to be doing, and what aren't we doing in terms of taking a strategic approach?
All right, so we've heard previous speakers talk about risk and understanding what's coming towards us, being able to navigate the complexity that is clearly relevant to everybody in the audience in the previous panels. We have our own national security strategy, signed by Cabinet the 4th of August, 23. Since then, there are no other supporting strategies anchored off that from a national security point of view. There are agency policies and there are some agency department strategies. But the issues that have been raised in previous panels about cross-cutting agency boundaries, we live in the information age, not the industrial age. So when a health problem appears, it's the Ministry of Health. Well, clearly, those days are gone. We need to be able to move in an agile, adaptive manner with a national security system that is actually focused and allowed to exercise contingency planning. And the contingency planning, ideally, should be, as we see in other mature nations, a private-public sector relationship. In other Western countries, members of industry will be given a national security clearance and invited in for strategic discussions. And then risks, as we see at the moment on the National Risk Register that we heard about before, 28 risks. if you read the National Risk Register, in my view, they're events. An earthquake is not an event, not a risk, it's an event. We live on the joint of tectonic plates. Where is the risk against our health, wealth, and national security and interest? And actually working out how we might exercise that at the national level and how we might use the technologies that we have in our own nation. And we had previous speakers talking about data. In my mind, data is the oil of pre-crisis, crisis, conflict, and war, as it is the data of industry. When you can identify, locate, process, exploit, and disseminate data at the speed of technology and mission, you are better informed, your decision cycle speeds up, and therefore your reaction and action cycle speeds up. Other nations practice these things and do it regularly at the national level. We would benefit if we were able to actually see what we know is coming so that we don't have a shock.
I wonder though, one of the reasons we don't do that is we don't say the quiet stuff out loud.
Yep.
Because we're fearful of offending larger people.
And we, hope is not a strategy. There's a book written on that and there's a lot of experience on it. I think there is still a naivety around, let's talk about what can go bump in the night and then turn on the lights and see if it actually is what went bump.
What do you think, Rosemary? Is that an important element? I mean, I look at, one of the things that, and we need to talk about it soon, is the whole sort of perceived China-US trade-off. Now, if we were having a panel here 10 years ago, it would have been all about who has served as an ambassador to China, because that was the way we were facing at the time and trying to understand, partly because we were taking the US relationship was settled. But now we're here, and our biggest trading partner is China. Our biggest security partner has been the US. Are we at the point where we actually have to say the quiet bit out loud, which is, how do we manage it if we're forced to make a choice?
Yeah, I don't think this is new. I mean, I think actually we've been straddling this quite difficult divide for quite some time.
Yes.
At a certain point, once the free trade agreement with China really kicked in and we started to get the full benefit from it, we were already in that position where, for the first time in our history, our strongest trade relationship was not with our strongest, with a partner that we were totally of the same kind of worldview or set of values with. And so, we've had to manage that. I mean, I think there's a little too much made of this business about having to choose. Let's face it, China is also the top trading partner for the US. Every country virtually is having to manage this difference of where the weight of a trade relationship sits and where other dimensions of a bilateral relationship sit. What do you think, Tim?
Well, I think you're 100% correct. And to capture your point, I've often used the metaphor that, if you want to play in the circus, as we do, you've got to learn to ride two horses at once.
Yeah.
And absolutely, as you say, successive New Zealand governments over the last 20 years have been extremely adept at riding those two horses at once. The only qualification I would add to that, because that's the general picture, and it's 100% correct, is that there are certain specific situations where the horses are not tethered together and we have to make a choice about which we're going to jump on. And in my view, perhaps reflecting my own centrist sort of views, but centre-right views, it'll always be the United States. No, I'm looking beyond Trump when I say this.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I'll give you a classic example of it instead of talking in generalities. When it comes, Peter Beck, founder of Rocket Lab, came into my office just before I finished my stint as Minister of Trade and said, I'm going bankrupt. And I said, well, what's the problem? He said, the problem is US export controls. And I learned from him then, that I didn't realize this, that US export controls are also controls over very, very sensitive people and what they can contribute to other countries. So I went off to Washington shortly thereafter and met this wonderful US official, Dr. Rose Gottemuller, who later became Deputy Secretary General of NATO, a wonderful person. And of course, you know, we couldn't negotiate anything with them. We had nothing to offer them other than the Pentagon's strong interest in Peter's project, because I went to Michael Fay's island to see, by the way...
That's when it was large skyrockets.
It was Michael Fay, it wasn't Epstein's island, okay? and as we know, Michael Fay is beyond reproach, okay? So I went to see her and I said, look, I can't propose a negotiation, that'd be ludicrous. We understand that missiles that have got a capacity to fly 3,000 to 5,000 kilometers lie at the heart of some of the most sensitive US security concerns. But could we perhaps set up a process where we get some genuine US experts and a few New Zealanders to work with them and see if we could put a creative option in front of you, Rose? And to her immense credit, she unleashed this process. It even ended up a year later with me when I was ambassador out there, signing a formal agreement between New Zealand and the United States. But it has very strict controls over conversing with certain other people in it. So there are going to be occasions, given our ongoing security relationship, forgetting all the stuff that happened 40 years ago, where we will have to decide which horse we will climb on when they go too far apart, and that will always be the American horse in the rest of my lifetime, I imagine.
Okay, well, let's talk then briefly about probably the most likely possible flag on that, which is the Taiwan Strait. And I don't know the likelihood of that. John, you probably have a better understanding than the rest of us. But if the balloon went up, is that the point, John, you think, that we would have to make a choice?
So there's been no end of analytical work on the One China policy and the reclamation of Taiwan under a PLA activity. Exercises conducted in the Taiwanese Strait late last year showed an indication and a capability. If we're being very clear around this, there are now 3 aircraft carriers afloat inside the first island chain, with a 4th one launching this year. Those capabilities are built for a clear outcome. They're not built to deliver humanitarian aid and assistance. What would happen if a naval blockade went in? Because we would see this happen in stages. The naval blockade would cause trade movement problems. At some stage, we would have to think about what that meant for our trade into the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And that would also be a discussion with our friends in Seoul and in Tokyo and Hawaii, and the rest of the world would be very anxious because we bleed very quickly into the Malacca Straits and Singapore with all sorts of issues. The requirement to make a deliberate national decision, and we're talking about big decisions for a small nation. My experience from a combat operator is at the tactical level, you choose your course quickly and move quickly. At an operational level, you pause and think about second, third order effects. At a strategic level, you keep every option open until you are forced to move. From a defence and security point of view, the discussion on the world stage, and bearing in mind that the Secretary General of NATO came into our region last year and said the threat that they see comes from here. This is an organisation designed to defeat Soviet Russia. It's a very different complex challenge, which I think is occupying a lot of strategic thought across not just our little nation, but all of our neighbours. I haven't answered it in, perhaps I'm becoming a politician, am I? I now need to think.
That's very good. I want to change tack a little bit now, conscious of time. One of the recent developments for us internationally is the proposed Indian FTA and the announced Indian FTA. I just want a quick take from the three of you as to how important that is, because there's been some natural enough domestic politics. It's announced an election year, lots of noise around it, and of course it's like most trade agreements, and one of the most frustrating things for politicians is you can't say what's actually in it until you can, and all those niceties. How important is it to New Zealand's security and trade and foreign affairs future to have that FTA? Start with you, Tim.
Well, I think refused 5 media interviews on this question because it's become part of the domestic arm wrestle between the coalition parties. But I'm looking at it from, a global
Rise above it, Tim.
rising above it, you know, as one can when you've left
That's right.
the
You've
bear
left the
pit.
arena, so
when
you're
you've
now,
left the
you're
bear
now
pit of
looking down
Parliament,
upon it.
you can be very distinguished. It's very important, but it's just another piece in this chain of agreements that provides New Zealand additional opportunities and security. And it is really intriguing. You know, I mean, we have been trying to do this damn thing since 2007, when I went up as opposition spokesperson. Phil Goff was the minister, at the invitation of Kamal Nath, the Indian Commerce Minister, whom I was very friendly with because of my earlier roles, and came back and negotiated a set of principles. I reminded Kamal Nath at the end of the negotiation, look, I'm not actually the trade minister, I'm his opponent. So I went back and gave Taha McPherson, Phil's private secretary, the principles I negotiated. And Phil started the negotiation. And John Key and I put a huge emphasis on it, and it came to nothing because all countries failed to negotiate with India up until around about 2020, because India was such a deeply protectionist country. But India's begun to move. And I think it started with the Australians successfully negotiating. 17% of Australian exports go to India. For us, I think it's around about 1.5 billion. I think it's around about 2% or something like this. But India is beginning to move. And India is already just knocking on Germany's door as the third largest economy. I think it's very important we get a toehold in there to protect us for anything against discrimination against New Zealand when other countries like Australia have got a deal.
And Rosemary, in your view, could it be as big for us as the China FTA was for the last 15 years?
I think so. I mean, I totally agree with Tim. This is hugely important, but also for the sort of strategic messaging, because, what we've done so successfully, well, again, hats off to Tim, has been to diversify since way back, since 1961, when the UK, huge market for us, decided to go into the European community. But it's now, because we have to be prepared for a changed trade environment as well as a changed political or geostrategic environment, really important that we use every opportunity to embed ourselves even more securely in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think, quite apart from the economic and the trade opportunities out of this free trade agreement with India, it's also a really important sort of geostrategic positioning. And while we've been incredibly nimble and creative on the trade side at diversifying over the last 30 years, we haven't done so well in terms of embedding ourselves in the architecture of the Indo-Pacific. We've done less well on that, on the sort of security and defence side, as others like the Australians or others, and this is more John's patch, but we've got some catch up to do there. All comes back to, yes, this is a good development.
John, where does the relationship with India fit in geopolitically from our perspective, do you think? I mean, India's, it's a big nation. It's always had a bob each way, really, if you think about it, in the world. Is it part of our strategic architecture in the next 20 years?
I think we're probably part of their strategic architecture.
Yes.
So to ignore the geography of India would be remiss. The mere fact that the Americans turned their Pacific Command from Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command is a very clear geopolitical statement. Obama's first overseas travel was to India, what they called the pivot, and what that meant from a US point of view signals all sorts of things. To ignore a nation that we have such close relationships over many years. I mean, our soldiers, sailors and airmen have served together on multiple United Nations missions. We've served under and alongside Indian leadership in a range of UN missions. They share place on the world stage where we can hopefully reclaim some of this rules-based international order. But we should do so, as we should in any other environment, understanding what might be the security challenges as we move forward.
Tim, you mentioned that India was very protectionist for a long time. I think that's right. I'm sort of picking up a comment that Rosemary made earlier about the US, but do you think that potentially part of the reason it's open to FTAs now and is doing these deals is actually down to an increase in confidence in its place in the world and its growth and those sorts of things?
Oh, I'm sure that's at the heart of it. And the question is, how far will this go and how ambitious will they be? Arvind Subramanian, a brilliant Indian economist who's, I think, chief economist at the IMF, has written a very intriguing article on this in this week's Economist, if you people want to follow up in detail on your question, in which he's arguing this is the moment India now needs to move into manufacturing. It has got a unique opportunity with its labor force. It's got the relationship with the United States that China doesn't have. And the first step is to move in a more pro-trade direction. So, I mean, read the article, it puts it much better than I have today in a short sentence or two. I think, I mean, there's still going to be huge opposition of all issues, dairy. Because what we have to understand about dairy is, first of all, New Zealand is the world's largest dairy exporter, but we're only 3% of global production. India is the world's largest dairy producer. But there are, in the largest state of India, Uttar Pradesh, there are literally 200 million people, and they produce the same volume of milk as 8,000 New Zealand dairy farms produce. So they are vastly inefficient. It's peasant agriculture of the most primitive type. I don't think we can expect that to open up for us in any substantial way, but on global manufacturing, I think this is a really intriguing thing to watch.
Okay. And not least because, you know, the Indians are fearful, and I remember this from when I went there, of just having the city swamped by people leaving the farms. I mean, the cities are already swamped as they've grown. Look, apology to everybody in the room who's sent questions on Slido. For some reason, my Slido's finally not working at all, so I've got no idea what your questions are. Maybe somebody will be able to fix that up. But I'm trying to ask what I anticipate your questions to be anyway. Carney's speech, can we come back to that? And in particular, his comment about the middle powers working together. How realistic is that? And obviously, we're not a middle power, we're a little fella. How do we participate, and should we try and it obviously brings in Australia quite quickly, right? Because they are a middle power. So how does all that fit together, and what's our role in that, and does it change our relationship with Australia in any meaningful way? Perhaps, Rosemary, start with you.
Well, I think our relationship with Australia changed, you know, when Trump came back for the second time, to be honest. I think it actually caused us both to really reassess how important our trans-Tasman relationship was. Not that we were ever in any doubt about that. But I think, you know, the sort of call to greater coordination amongst middle powers that Prime Minister Carney has made just reminds us that we do have to attach to the middle powers that are friendly to us and that we're allied with in the case of Australia, and try to keep ourselves relevant and afloat in that way. I mentioned at the beginning, you know, there's a real risk in this newly hostile international environment that we just do come adrift, or that we just become irrelevant. I think, you know, we can certainly do our best to protect our own interests by shoring up those relationships, but also in our wider Indo-Pacific area. We've already done it with ASEANs, with this government's been particularly, you know, reaching out to strengthen those relationships, special relationship with Singapore. We've already got very well-developed connections to Japan, Korea. But I think the importance of the Carney speech is that it kind of gave a psychological boost to everybody to think, okay, yeah, we can do something different. It's a different world.
John, what's your thoughts? You obviously got views on the Australian relationship generally. Is it time to strengthen it further? What's the deal?
I totally agree with what Rosemary said. The relationship with our Anzac brothers and sisters, in my mind, and I consider myself an Anzac, having gone ashore into East Timor and other locations with my Australian mates. That's a bond that we should always reinforce for a whole lot of reasons. And I think the Canadian PM speech was exceptional, an exceptional clarion call for a range of reasons, as we, and as a previous speaker said, in our small waka, look to steer into this weather. We should not ignore our neighbours to the north, i.e. those Southwest Pacific nations with whom I think we can bond and do other things as well. a raft together attached to a bigger flotilla produces a better strategic effect.
Because it feels like we have to look bigger
Yeah,
by being part of something bigger.
yeah.
So I'm going to ask Tim in a slightly different way. There's always been talk of a sort of three-way relationship, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore. It's popped up at different points. Is that something that we should be pushing out of? And I know we're a little bit at Australia's beck and call in that respect, but is there something we should be doing in our corner, to John's point, which strengthens us trade-wise and defence-wise and security-wise?
Well, I think there's a very specific thing that needs to be upgraded, and that was mentioned in Mark Carney's brilliant speech, and that is this dialogue between the 39 countries of the European Union and the 39 countries in total of European Union plus the Trans-Pacific Partnership countries.
Yes.
Collectively, they are 2.5 times the size of the United States in world trade. I've been arguing this now internationally for a year and a half, and I've made 3 or 4 presentations quite recently to international conferences. And they've actually endorsed the concept. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, endorsed it, as did our Prime Minister, as did Keir Starmer, and Mark Carney has now raised this. My argument, and I'm in communication with various people around the world on this, is you need to lead the political profile. You know, and I've actually quoted a John Key test to them, explained who John was, that you may remember, which was, John would say to us from time to time, look, I can understand only up to a certain point what you, the Minister of Transport, you, the Minister of Agriculture, are doing. But if I don't see it reflected eventually in the media, it hasn't happened. So technically, the dialogue has started. There was a meeting in Melbourne on the 20th of November last year of the countries concerned, and they issued a communique that, as a WTO, TECO, I wouldn't disagree with a single goddamn word in it, but it's politically invisible. It was never even, I searched through ChatGPT and through Gemini, there was no mention of it in The Economist, the Financial Times, or the Wall Street Journal, which means by the John Key test, it hasn't happened.
Yes.
And this is where we need to lift the political profile, because if I just quickly complete the thought here, one of the biggest mistakes we can make is to assume that we have forever lost the United States, not to the existing rules-based system. That's gone. I understand that in terms of the trading system. They'll never come back and knock on the door of the WTO and say, sorry, we left, can we come back in again? No. But have we lost the United States forever to a slightly modulated rules-based system? Now, I don't know the answer to that, but it would be a dangerous strategic mistake to wash that away as a scenario. And that's where this has to start, outside the WTO, in this grouping, to offer a future president, because Trump is beyond reach, a future president. What about this system that your allies, friends, and partners have put together?
But then Rosemary, to Tim's point, though, the Europeans are nodding, but we're not seeing a massive amount of visibility on that. Do you think, from your networks, does this TPP EU is it real at this point, or actually do we have a lot of work to do?
Sorry, the question?
Or do you think it's actually has a chance of becoming a strategic partnership between Europe and the...
Yeah, I think it's got real potential. I think it will go somewhere, yes. Yeah, because I think everybody's seeing what new connections they can make. And the Europeans are also looking at what does the world look like for them and where do they need to make new connections. I mean, they've just done a deal with Mercosur, I think.
Well, there's a job for the new government. Just before we close, whoever wins at the end of the year, just before we close, I just want to ask John about rare earth minerals. The Americans are making a lot of noise about it. How real is that as both an opportunity for New Zealand and a risk if we don't play the game with the rare earth minerals?
Oh, yes.
Yep. What's your sense on that?
So it's a really good issue. So currently China mines just over 60% of rare earth elements and processes over 90% of rare earth elements. Those rare earth elements are fundamentally required for modern information technology systems, guidance systems, gyros, stabilizers, magnets, everything that allows aircrafts and ships, trade and warships to maneuver. Those things are clearly important to the US. Project Vault, which is the US project to secure rare earth elements, have seen significant deals with Australia, Canada, I think there's 2 other nations in Southeast Asia. We have those here in New Zealand. We have a range of rare earth elements, and gold today trades at over 5,000 US an ounce. My grandfather drove the Grey River dredge up the Grey Valley during World War II. That gold sits in the US Gold Reserve and paid for the Singapore wharfs as part of a defence and strategic deal. If we want to look at productivity and cost, then why would we not be thinking about what that means and who we might like to share that with and how?
It sounds like it is real and important. We have to wrap up, I'm sorry. Any final closing comments if they're really short?
If I could, real short, for my brothers and sisters that still serve our nation in uniform, and we spoke about superannuation, the cost of defence is not a percentage for a ship or a tank or a plane. You send us overseas, you break us, you bend us, we come home. Think about the cost of deployment and recovery and support to our veterans, and the discussion then is a mission cost is not that simple equation. We need to think differently about defence strategically, defence and security, which means our intelligence service and our diplomats, when we send them in harm's way, for those that make those decisions, we can do better.
Okay, thank you. Rosemary, any last?
I'm just feeling really guilty that one of the really important aspects of our relationships and our security is our relationships with our Pacific Island neighbours. We haven't even discussed that.
No.
So I just put that on the table as, you know, another thing we need to think about in this changed world.
Tim, last word?
I think we have got a very settled policy on external linkages, which successive New Zealand governments of both sides of the fence have followed in the last 45 years. And the most important thing is carry on London, continue in this direction, because with that type of stable framework, which allows modulation for the centre-left and the centre-right, we have actually surmounted major challenges in the past, and I have every confidence that the next generation of New Zealanders can do the same, provided the political base for that still exists.
Thank you very much to all 3 of you. As you know, as you can see, we could have done at least another hour to touch on some of the other topics, but it's been a fantastic panel. To the panelists who brought all this experience to the table and given us the opportunity to look in. Thank you very, very much for being here. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think you deserve a prize as the last panel of the day for keeping the audience, and myself included, absolutely spellbound by that panel. So thank you. And if there were a prize, not that I want to objectify John, but if there were a prize for the best footwear on panel, it would certainly be John with those cowboy boots. They're fabulous. So we've come to the end of the proceedings. I'm going to ask Jen, the Pro Vice-Chancellor, to come in and close the proceedings. But I just want to say a few words myself. It's been a fascinating couple of days. In my adult life, I cannot remember a time or a moment as dramatic as this in the world. And I feel like we have covered the important and difficult choices we have ahead of us. And I think it was John who also said, hope is not a strategy, but neither is a conference. And out of this conference, I think Brad said at some point, we have to prioritise and do the best things first, and we have to do them rapidly because we are on something of a burning platform. And Rosemary's warning, we may become irrelevant and disappear if we don't adapt. So what we do after this conference is everything. And the 2 things I take away from it, one is the political stability in our country in this very volatile world, but also the importance not of consensus across policy, but of joined up policies. You cannot talk about trade and security without talking about the global situation. You cannot talk about immigration without talking about regional policy and treaty obligations. You can't talk about productivity
without talking about our infrastructure policy, our AI national strategy. There was a challenge thrown down to have an AI national strategy. You can't talk about superannuation without talking about health. These are all connected. And we are in election year, so my final quote for the day, for the last 2 days, it was from British pollster Michael Ashcroft, who many of you will know. He said, "If an election is an exam, voters will set the question. Parties that choose to answer a different question will be marked accordingly." Kia ora. Thank you, everybody, for a wonderful couple of days.
Thank you, Josie. Big choices for a small nation was where we started this conversation, and I think, well, at least I hope you will all agree we've had some very good conversations about those things. It's not the role of this forum to propose solutions or to identify metrics that might tell us we're on our way to solutions, although I think we've heard some views proffered forward about some things that will work and not work. However, I did think we reached one completely clear metric about the silver tsunami, the superannuation debate, which is that we must solve this before Brad Olsen gets within spitting distance of retirement. So I look forward to the politicians and the policymakers taking on that challenge. The other takeaway that I want to just leave you with, thank you Marcel for the words, is not to get caught up in the tyranny of averages. So yes, we have a productivity problem, but we don't have a productivity problem everywhere. And that is true for all of our challenges. We have pockets where we do well, where we do really, really well, and we need to double down on this. And that's important, I think, as we go forward, because sometimes when we look into big choices, we get hopeless and helpless, and that doesn't take us forward. The second thing that struck me was the criticality of leadership at this time, and in particular leaders who can handle the duality of leadership, which is to hold two completely opposite points of view in your head and your hands and your heart at the same time. To be able to be bold, visionary and brave, with pragmatic, politically astute and with a fair degree of low cunning. To make unpopular decisions, to face down your critics, to hold the course, and to listen intently to others and pivot when you need to. And most importantly, to maintain your humility and a low personal ego at the same time as a driving will to make change. That's the sort of leadership we need in our communities, in our businesses, and in our nations. And I'm heartened by the fact that I see a lot of those leaders here today. It only remains for me to thank a number of people, our speakers, our panellists, moderators, and all the participants. Thank you so much. Our wonderful MC, Josie Pagani, you were amazing. The organising team led by Paula Sutton, just fantastic team, so well done. And finally, our sponsors and partners whose support means so much. IAG, Craig's, RCP and The Post. Thank you all so much for coming. Ngā mihi nui and travel safe home. Thank you.